Welcome to another episode of the Swamp247 Podcast. I am your host, Graham Hall, joined by my co-host, Zach Goodall. And Florida spring camp is inching closer. We now know what the coaching staff looks like. The roster is complete. The roster breakdown has been released. I know it's a long wait until football actually returns in Gainesville. It's a long wait every single time, for me at least, when the college football playoff ends and the Super Bowl wraps up. But it'll be here before we know it, and certainly with spring camp just around the corner here, less than a month away in Gainesville, it is going to be an exciting time sooner than later here. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the inaugural coaching staff that John Summerall has constructed in Gainesville, from offensive coordinator Buster Faulkner, the assistants that were brought from Georgia Tech and Tulane, defensive coordinator Brad White and some of his assistants that he's familiar with, from Day One Wilkins to Chris Collins. And we're going to give our thoughts also at the end of this episode on Florida cleaning up its special teams mistakes. So, Zach, let's jump right into it. I think of any of the assistants that Florida added to this staff, Buster Faulkner is the one that led most people to be optimistic. You know, we don't need to rehash too much about just what went wrong in the Billy Napier era, but if there was a common criticism, and there certainly were a good bit of them, it was the lack of a true bona fide offensive play caller who had control of the scheme and was taking something off of the plate. You know, Billy Napier, he elevated guys to have that offensive coordinator title, from Russ Callaway, and obviously Rob Sale had it for a while, and Steve Spurrier Jr., who remains in Gainesville, was involved in that as well. But it still was Billy Napier's offensive design and his decision making. That is not going to be the case in 2026 for Florida. John Summerall, obviously a defensive-minded coach, and you would think that he has more involvement in Florida's defensive scheme and play calling. Obviously, Brad White is going to lead the charge there, but this is going to be Buster Faulkner's show, from bringing in quarterback Aaron Philo to bringing multiple assistants with him from Georgia Tech, from Trent McKnight to the assistant quarterbacks coach and AJ Urdelli, who has been instrumental in Philo's development the last 2 years up there in Atlanta. Buster Faulkner spoke to the media. We actually had a chance to speak to the majority of the assistants now, which is why we are going to go over and give our initial impressions of this coaching staff. But Buster Faulkner spoke to the media, and he said a lot of things that I think are going to appeal to Florida fans, from the desire to have 4 wide receivers out there to cater the offensive scheme to the personnel at Florida's disposal, to the quarterback battle that Florida is going to have in spring camp. I know that I mentioned Aaron Philo, and I think a lot of people have expected him to be the starting quarterback, but you return Tramell Jones Jr. as well. You have Aiden Warner back in the fold. You have a highly touted freshman quarterback in Will Griffin as well. They're not going to just hand the keys to the offense to Philo, at least not yet. I mean, he may end up being Florida's starting quarterback. That actually would surprise me if he isn't, but they are going to have a quarterback competition when spring camp opens in less than a month on March 3rd here in Gainesville. From hearing Buster Faulkner speak to the media last week, what stood out to you, Zach? What were your big takeaways of hearing Buster Faulkner speak? Was it the 4 wide? Was it him catering the offense around having whatever the quarterback skill set is? You know, at Georgia Tech, he had a run-first quarterback in Haynes King, and then Aaron Philo gets in a game, and he had more than 600 passing yards in one game when he was out there. So what stood out to you when you heard Faulkner speak about what his desire is for Florida's offense in his first season in Gainesville?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, really, with your overall summary of the past and the future. Billy Napier, not just as a play caller, but I think what was his ultimate undoing was his, adamant belief that his scheme, his offense, really, regardless of who would be calling the plays, would work. And it was a throwback style, the Alabama type offense that you saw in the 2000s to early teens. That's what he was molded by. Clemson did the same thing. And it was just outdated. Buster Faulkner, I mean, you look at Georgia Tech, but you also look at his entire coaching past as a coordinator. It's the total opposite. He's not stuck in his ways. He is adaptable, like you mentioned. He will mold an offense based around the talent that he has at quarterback, his offensive line, his skill positions, and he'll change things as he goes. And that, to me, just hearing it, there's a difference between hearing it and actually seeing it unfold. But it is refreshing right off rip. Like, I remember Billy Napier in one of his first press conferences that I think I asked the question. I asked him about his usage of 12 personnel in like his second month on the job. And he was like, yeah, it's pretty well documented the way I call an offense. It's just a totally different style and approach to what they want to do. Now, Florida fans look at Buster Faulkner's past working in the air raid, coming from Valdosta State, the Mike Leach influence, for example, and people assume this is going to be an air raid offense. I would, tap the brakes on that a little bit. I don't think we're going to see them trot out in 10 personnel or even 5 receiver sets on every play. It's going to be pro style, largely based out of 11 personnel with 3 receivers, 1 running back, and a tight end. But we'll see flexibility. We'll see them move into 4 receiver sets, into 10 personnel. Like, you could probably count on one hand the number of times Billy Napier utilized 10 personnel per season, really, because you would still, even in empty, have a tight end out in the big slot, have a running back out wide. I don't think we're going to see that very much. I think we'll see more, whether it's a tight end and 4 receivers, and they've got loads of them at this point, or a running back and 4 receivers. I mean, you have to, right? When you've got your 2 returning, let's call them star freshmen, even though there's work for them to do to continue being productive, in Vernell Brown and Dallas Wilson. You get Eric Singleton, who is an NFL draft entrant. He just didn't sign the NFLPA agent to, officially declare for the draft and forego his college eligibility. So you get someone of that caliber back. You start looking, TJ Abrams breaking out in a bit of a role last year. Some of the other guys that were brought in through the portal, and Bailey Stockton, Micah Mays, Jalen Lloyd, and even these freshmen, Davian Gross for one. Justin Williams is another that I was really high on. Marquez Daniel is someone who might need a little more development. But ultimately, I think they're kind of loaded at receiver. And when you think about that, yeah, you kind of have to operate out of 11 personnel largely and move into 10, maybe even get some 5 receiver sets sprinkled in there. I think they just have a lot of options. You obviously pair that with Jaden Baugh coming back. Buster Faulkner's got a lot to work with in his skill positions. It's going to come down to, like you mentioned, this quarterback competition. I'm just like you. I would be surprised if it's not Aaron Philo. The expectation was, if Buster Faulkner stayed at Georgia Tech, Aaron Philo would be the starter there this season. So I think, at least in terms of familiarity, especially with the scheme, how practice is going to operate for the offense, he's got an advantage over Tramel Jones, although I'm still excited to see Jones's development this offseason. And then this offensive line. It lost 3 starters. There's a way in which they could end up losing 4 if they make a change at right tackle, based on some of the players they brought in and the development of someone maybe like Fletcher Westfall, for example. So there's a lot of personnel changes going on. That's what's going to be the important part of spring and fall camp for Buster Faulkner, to really identify what his lineup's going to look like, what his rotation's going to look like. But I have no doubt that whatever those lineups and rotations look like, he is going to call plays and develop a scheme that best matches the talent that he's got on the field.
Yeah, talking about the quarterback battle, I think it would kind of be a little bit of a red flag in a sense if Aaron Philo, a quarterback who certainly has promise, but was really handed the starting quarterback job, or even won it early into his time at Florida, because what Florida needs, without really a proven quarterback on the roster, Tramel Jones appeared in a handful of games last season as a freshman. Aaron Philo hasn't been a full-time starter. Aiden Warner, not really a guy considered to be in the mix to win the job, has had some time where he has been able to lead Florida, and obviously he took a ton of first team reps a season ago in spring camp when DJ Lagway was dealing with his shoulder injury, along with Harrison Bailey. And then you have a true freshman in Will Griffin. What I'm saying is that you want Tramel Jones and maybe even Griffin or Warner to push Philo to a point where they're going to have to take a hard, long look at this quarterback position so that they feel comfortable having 2 quarterbacks. I mean, if you have a situation where Philo wins it immediately, I guess you could look at it from a glass half full perspective and think, oh man, this guy is clearly better than people thought. His familiarity with the offensive scheme is really appealing to just him getting a head start. He knows the verbiage a little bit more. It just makes sense for him to be the guy. But ideally, you would like Tramel Jones to make them question that a little bit, where Jones is able to perform at a higher rate in his second spring in Gainesville, where you're sitting here and seeing his development and saying, hey, we feel comfortable with either one of those guys. We want to have them keep battling it out and pushing each other into fall camp. So I can understand why maybe people are already penciling in Philo as being the starting quarterback, but from a competition standpoint, you want Tramel Jones to be in the mix as long as possible in my mind. So I'm excited to see how it all shakes out. Obviously, some inexperienced quarterbacks here in Gainesville, some guys that they feel comfortable with. And that competition is going to be what is going to be key in my mind to elevating both of those guys that we expect to be in the mix for that starting quarterback job. I want to look briefly just at, Brad White was maybe not as exciting of a name as Buster Faulkner was. And I understand that, Kentucky maybe doesn't have the greatest reputation, certainly among Florida fans, even though, they got that 31-point win last season in Lexington. Brad White's been an established defensive coordinator at Kentucky and has put a lot of guys in the league, but you don't really think of Kentucky as being like this true defensive powerhouse in a sense here. And, there was that quote that John Summerall had at his introductory press conference where he said, "I don't really hire my friends." But you look at the connections that are on this Florida coaching staff, from the Tulane guys to obviously John Summerall worked with Brad White when he was at Kentucky before he became a head coach back in 2021. He has a lot of familiarity there with Brad White and his scheme, and he trusts him in what he looks to do and what he can do with, I think, even more talented personnel. But from hearing Brad White speak, and I want to get your take on this as well, it sounds like you have a defensive coordinator who's going to look to be aggressive, is going to look to cross-train the secondary at multiple positions, is going to look to utilize the safeties in a lot of blitzing scenarios to kind of take, a lot of high risk, high reward type situations here. And the talent that Florida returns from linebackers, Miles Graham, Aaron Childs, obviously getting the cornerbacks back, and Dijon Johnson and Cormani McLean, a lot of the young guys like Laganza Hayward and Jabari Flowers. There's a lot of guys on this team that could be able to make leaps in Brad White's scheme. From hearing Brad White talk and from what you've read about Brad White, just what do you make of the hire and his decision to come to Gainesville and Florida's decision to hire him as the first-year defensive coordinator? And kind of what are some of your expectations for this defense under Brad White when spring camp gets underway and then when eventually this 2026 season arrives in September?
Yeah, to build off what you mentioned with the not hiring friends quote, like I understand Florida fans then saw the connections he brought in and had that reaction, but I think it's important to remember maybe they were friends. Maybe they weren't super close. Who knows? One way or another, when John Summerall worked with Brad White, he was running a very good defense at Kentucky. These past couple of years, it fell off a little bit, and I think that's the talent gap. I think that's NIL. But in the first half, first 2/3 of his tenure as the Wildcats defensive play caller, that defense was nice, especially for not being as well recruited as some other ones in the SEC. And it's a multiple type of scheme. Again, kind of like with Billy Napier and his offense, Florida's defense was pretty solid the past couple of years. Not great other than that little run at the end of 2024. But again, it was like the scheme was the scheme. There wasn't much changing. They expected players to fit into what they were doing, and it had its hits and it had its misses. Brad White's defense, people confuse it as just a 3-4. I really think it's more of a 4-2-5 that can flex into 3-4, that can flex into 3-3-5. There's going to be packages where they either have a nickel or maybe they keep a strong side linebacker on the field. I look at someone like Aaron Childs, if he keeps developing as a coverage guy. Was it Brad White who mentioned it? I'm pretty sure it was. He was like, people like to think that player may not match up well with a slot, but that slot also isn't used to a 6'2", 240-some player pressing him at the line. And that's the type of vision I have for Aaron Childs, just for one example. But you think about that, you think about the cross-training in the secondary, as you mentioned, and that's exactly what this defense is going to be. It's going to be multiple. They're going to have players lining up in different spots. I'm sure there will be blitzing from a lot of different angles with four-mans. I don't think we'll see as much simulated pressure as we got used to the past couple of years. We'll see some, but I think it'll be more traditional in the sense that whether it's a 3-4, whether it's a 4-2, 4-3, you'll see four guys and they want to have four pass rushers who can just get after it. Some blitz is sprinkled in, but they want to win with four-man pressures. I'm excited about it, if only because, again, it's nice to see a willingness to adapt and that there will be multiple different looks from both the offense and the defense moving forward. It's not going to be cookie cutter. It's not going to be pigeonholing players and hoping something will work. They're going to change. They're going to adapt based on the personnel they have. And you look at Florida's defense. I mean, there's a lot of inexperience and new faces on the offense. On defense, they got a ton of their core talent back. I mean, Miles Graham and Jaden Woods are the ones that stand out as part of that like Fab Five, so they call it. But you get Brendan Bett back on the interior. Jamari Lyons, who coming off his ankle injury last year, wasn't amazing, but in a limited role, he was productive at times. And you can go across the board. Aaron Childs, Jaden Robinson at linebacker. In the secondary, I think they got their best player back other than Devin Moore going to the draft and Bryce Thornton. And they've really rebuilt that safety room with some upside as well as some experience in their additions of DJ Coleman and Cam Dooley, for example. At corner, you've got your next three after Devin Moore returning in Dijon Johnson, Cormani McLean, Javari Flowers from last season. There's a strong nucleus of talent that's going to give this coaching staff options as it creates these different packages that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think that overall, the belief is that Florida's defense is far less of an issue, was far less of an issue last year than the offense, and retaining that core talent with a new, scheme is not going to be as big of an issue as elevating Florida's offense was. And not just Brad White coming to Gainesville, but, Greg Gasparotto, who was John Summerall's defensive coordinator at Tulane. And then you brought in multiple coaches as well on the defensive side of the ball. Bam Hardmon as well. We're going to talk about him here in a little bit with Phil Trautwein, two former Gators who are now back in Gainesville. The defense just wasn't as big of a concern in my mind after last season. I think that more than anything, it was retaining those players that you mentioned, from the guys in the secondary to, Cam James as well, getting Miles Graham and Aaron Childs back. And then a lot of the young guys from Drake Stubbs to Javari Flowers, Lagonza Hayward, that was more critical in my mind than going out there and landing maybe the hot name at defensive coordinator that's out there. I think that the job that White has done and his track record with talent around him within his defense, it's going to be more than just simply good enough here. So that was far less of a concern to me in my mind. But this is the feel good time of the season, the year, so to speak, for coaches. I mean, it's rare that you lose people in an introductory press conference. Go back to the whole Lane Kiffin to Florida saga. A lot of people were not too happy with the hiring of John Summerall, and then he comes out in the introductory press conference and absolutely kills it. And every public appearance or media opportunity that he's had in the past, 3 months since has kind of reinforced the notion to people that this is someone that they can get behind. It's someone who wants to win. And I think that what he has said has been so positive and energizing that everyone from who I've talked to has kind of forgotten about Lane Kiffin, is the pursuit of him, and they're all in on John Summerall. With all that said, though, and
do you mind if I build off that real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
I want your opinion on it too, because no one cares about a media member's perspective on how they're treated by a coach. They just don't. They're about their interactions or what they observe. But hasn't it been refreshing that not only is he energetic and positive, I also feel as though he's not beating around the bush with us. I think he's been really straightforward, and his staff has also reflected that. I mean, I can think of whether it's when he's been meeting with us or doing these podcasts he's been on, he's very willing to come out and be like, yeah, I wish we added another one or two interior defensive linemen. I'm not thrilled with the amount of experience we have in the secondary. I'm very curious to see how that builds out. I wish there was a second transfer portal window for first-year head coaches, because I just don't know where the talent level is. Again, would like your opinion on this, but at least from my perspective, I'm eating that up. I don't want to be sold something that's not authentic. And I felt like we kind of dealt with that. It almost in a way, and I don't mean to drag the coaching staff of the past too much, but I felt like there were moments of condescension when it came to the media. And so far, I feel like there's a true amount of respect radiating from John Summerall and his coaching staff, not just with us. Again, no one really cares how we feel, but in their messaging through us to the fan base, they're willing to be transparent and honest in their evaluation of what they've got ahead of them.
Okay, you may be in the honeymoon phase a little bit here, where you're appreciating the change in tone, and we'll see how long it lasts. John Summerall said something that I thought was pretty funny, but pretty prophetic in my mind, where he said, people may turn on us. We may lose a game here. He was joking, obviously, and people may turn on us a little bit, and we'll see when that happens how his messaging continues, if he continues to be transparent and give straightforward answers. But right now, it is certainly refreshing because just from a media perspective, and I think you can agree with this, it makes it a little bit easier for us to be willing to ask the difficult questions that people want to find out about. When you know that you actually have a legitimate chance at getting a introspective, honest answer, it makes it easier to be willing to do that, because there were certainly times the last 4 years where we wouldn't even try and ask something that people wanted to find out about, or we wouldn't, push something that was relevant because we knew that we wouldn't, or we knew what answer we were going to get, and we knew that it wouldn't be the one that people wanted to hear. And it would kind of, and I'm not saying it's a media member's job to try and be in the good graces of a coach, but it would be held against us negatively, and the perception would be that we're someone who is pushing questions and pushing a narrative, whatever you want to call it, knowing that we weren't going, when we should have known that we weren't going to get the answer that we were looking for. So I do hope it continues. We'll see here. Maybe we'll have to reflect in a couple of years and say, well, it was nice while it lasted here. And then eventually they started treating us where we didn't know anything, and we're just kind of out to, quote unquote, get the coaches or trap the coaches, whatever you want to call it. But you touched on where I wanted to go next in this episode, which was, you mentioned the comment about, I wish we would have added one more defensive lineman, because that is the position that, I don't know how well documented this is, but outside of the quarterback position in the transfer portal, interior defensive line is probably the most coveted position outside of the quarterback position. And that's just because there's not a whole bunch of options out there. Florida's freshman duo from last season, and in Joseph Mbachu and Jeremiah McLeod, Brad White had a great comment where he said, shout out to everyone who tried to get those guys in the portal after last season. That's because the position is so highly coveted, and there's not really a ton of guys with experience or with potential at the position that you feel comfortable bringing into a program and expecting them to contribute at a high rate from the jump. With all that said, even though they return those two guys and they get Brendan Bett back as well, and it certainly added some guys like Emmanuel with potential certainly for this team, they were pretty straightforward that they would have liked to get one more guy. They lost Mekhi Barrow from last year's team, and certainly, we'll see how big of a loss that ends up being for Florida. But they were honest that they would like to get one more at either 3-tech or nose tackle. When you look at Florida's defensive line, how much of developing depth and getting those young guys I mentioned to be able to compete for starting roles, and if not starting roles, be consistent rotation pieces for Florida, how critical do you think that is in spring camp? And just what's your assessment right now of the defensive line room in Gainesville?
Yeah, I think that's got to be, aside from quarterback, the most important position battle, so to speak. But also, again, to your point, like position in need of development right now. They go and get a couple of transfers there. Emmanuel Obadejo, I want to say. I should know that by now. But regardless, I like the upside there. He also has one season of college football experience as someone who moved here from England and was originally trying to get into the medical field, and then realized, oh, wait, I'm a good football player. I'm going to try this. I mean, like when he was at Jacksonville State last year, he was kind of a menace, even for a first-year player. I think he had 35 or 36 pressures on the year. Different level of competition, obviously, more development for him to do, but I really like that one. The thing is, his plan, or their plan for him, is for him to most often play strong side defensive end, Cam James's position. There will be a rotation there. If I'm Florida personally, he's 6'7", 305-ish pounds. I try and teach him some 3 technique, because you've got a lot of developing to do at that 3 technique and that nose position. Brendan Bett coming back is a good one for Florida. I mean, there's still room for him to grow too, but I thought he stepped in and performed solid to pretty well while Caleb Banks was out last year. The freshmen had nice moments, but they were freshmen. Joseph Mbachu is another one who had 1 year of playing experience. So there's a high ceiling there, but he's got a lot to do to try and reach it. DK Kalu is someone that I'm going to watch from Baylor. He's not necessarily your traditional nose, but I think of their group, he probably is the closest one to it of the scholarship contributors on this team. I'm curious to see what kind of growth he can show because he didn't necessarily pop up on the stat sheet, and that's not as important at nose. But he just wasn't uber productive at Baylor, and I'm curious to see what their plan is to get him going. But ultimately, they've got potential in those players. They kind of got a logjam on the strong side with Emmanuel, with Cam James. Even LJ McCray is seemingly moving back there from the weak side position. These guys, all three of them are pretty big to be edge rushers, even on the strong side. I'm curious how much some of them will work into the inside to create a rotation at three technique, allow some of those three techniques to even train at the nose tackle position. But it's just like a lot of moving pieces right now. There's a lot more in terms of needing players to solidify their roles across those three spots. The edge rushing, the jack edge rusher, the weak side, I think is pretty solidified. When you got Jaden Woods there, Kofi Asari was, pretty solid for a UMass transfer coming last year. He had some moments that were pretty nice, and you would hope that he can build on that. And then you got KJ Ford as well, the intriguing 4-star freshman that just came in. So that one player position seems pretty good. Those other three spots, I think it'll take till fall until they really know what they have and how they intend on using each of the players they have.
Yeah, I think it was, the retention of Gerald Chapman should alleviate some concerns about, Florida's defensive line depth because he was so heralded during his, last couple years in Gainesville for his practice coaching style, for his development, for his evaluating. So I'm of the belief that if Gerald Chapman wants you and thinks you can play in the SEC, that it deserves a little bit of credence here. Obviously, going back to the relationship of all the coaches, he's someone that had familiarity with John Summerall, both at Tulane as well. And, it was brief and Gerald Chapman, gets the Florida opportunity. And then he realizes, when John Summerall comes in that he has a chance to return here and ends up being retained. And I think that those concerns, like I said, about the depth along the defensive line are going to be alleviated a good bit by Chapman's presence. If there was someone outside of Buster Faulkner and maybe even the retention of Gerald Chapman that had Florida fans excited, it's, in my opinion, it's got to be the hiring of Phil Trautwein. That was someone that Florida fans have been, breaking down the doors for the last real decade to get him back in Gainesville. And it probably, not to talk too much about the previous regime, but I'm certain that they felt a little bit of, residual anger, so to speak, after the firing of Billy Napier, when you heard that Phil Trautwein has been adamant that he's wanted to be back in Gainesville the last couple of years. That's someone who didn't have a relationship with John Summerall, but ends up, in this day and age, agents are so key and they end up sharing the same agent. And, I don't know who reached out to who, but it became clear maybe the agent did all the work. So shout out to them, that Phil Trautwein was someone that could come to Gainesville and ends up being a fit that I think has a lot of people excited. With Phil Trautwein and Bam Hardmon as well, having that, a former star player in Hardmon and then a guy who won 2 national championships at Florida in Phil Trautwein. What do you make of those two hirings? And just from the intangible standpoint of like playing for the logo, not to quote Billy Gonzalez here too much, but, two guys who understand what it takes to play for the patch and come to Gainesville and kind of help ease this transition to a new coaching staff. How critical were those hirings in your mind in getting Hardmon, a guy who, had nearly 170 tackles in 2002, and Phil Trautwein, who's got the tattoos from winning the national championships in 06 and 08? Just what do you make of those two hirings? How critical do you think that they were for John Summerall when he was assembling his inaugural coaching staff in Gainesville?
I think it's huge primarily from a recruiting perspective. And like fans have their opinions on Mike Peterson as the edge rushers coach over the years. I think that there's something to be desired in terms of his development of players. I also think he recruited his edge position very well. I mean, I don't know if you get LJ McCray without Mike Peterson's influence, for example. And I know we're still waiting on a breakout from LJ McCray, but he was the second highest rated recruit that they got in the entire 4-year Billy Napier tenure. And there are other ones like that as well. KJ Ford, who I just mentioned. Big part of that was Mike Peterson getting him. So there were examples of an alumni, especially coming from a pretty good era of Florida football. He was more the Spurrier years, but still, there's definitely an advantage there. And Bam Hardmon said that specifically. He said he can go into homes of a recruit and just shoot a family straight, tell them exactly what it is they need to know, and answer questions about what this program can do for you. Even though that was a long time ago, it's still, he comes back for a reason, and he's got a lot of resources at his disposal because he's a Florida graduate. And the same thing will work for Phil. You look at their resumes, obviously Bam Hardman worked at a bit of a lower level, so I'm curious to see what he's able to get out of his edge rushers. But there was a really great pass rush coming out of Tulane the past couple of years. And I think that paired with his recruiting expertise and his ability to, sell this program should work pretty well for him. But Trautwein's definitely the one that, catches your attention. Not only has he recruited very well, I want to say he was like pushing double digits at Penn State in terms of blue chip recruits that he signed over the years, 4 to 5 stars, which Florida fans will love to hear that. He mentioned the other day that that's not really what he's looking for, the star rankings. If they've got him, great, but he wants someone that he knows he can develop. Well, you look at his development skills. I think in his college coaching career, he's had 31 all-conference offensive linemen in some capacity, whether it's first, second, third team. He's developed, I don't have the number in front of me, but I know it also was pushing double-digit NFL draft picks, highlighted by Chris Lindstrom from Boston College, the guard who went in the top 15 to Atlanta and has put together a very steady NFL career. Pro Bowler, I'm pretty sure. And Zion Johnson, too. That guy was a 0-star recruit at Davidson, where Trautwein started his coaching career as an offensive line coach, followed him to Boston College, developed into a first-round pick. You pair those two things together, someone that can recruit at a top level, as well as they can develop the guys that are, more in line with the offensive linemen that Florida's taken over the last few years and held on to in some cases. There's still some guys around that need to develop that were a little less coveted as recruits. And I think you've got a perfect offensive line coach to be able to accomplish both of those things. It only helps more that both of those coaches, again, have the ties here and are able to just be honest with these families about what this university can do for their kids.
Yeah, they've also been pretty honest that the facilities are far and away a lot better than they were when they were here. For those who don't know, during Phil Trautwein and Bam Hardman's tenure, not only was the indoor practice facility not there, obviously the Hefner Training Center wasn't there as well, but players used to have to meet at Ben Hill Griffin Stadium and then make about a 5 to 10 minute walk across the parking lot through the O-Dome to the practice field, and they would lose out on some critical practice time. The amenities that the players have now, from improved living facilities to obviously the strength and training center, from an intangible standpoint, they understand the past and what it was like, and they're probably going to push players a little bit harder because they've won and had success when they had less resources at their disposal. So they're going to, not coddle these guys in a sense. They're going to sit here and say, hey, we won championships when we were sleeping in dorm beds, when we didn't have unlimited snacks, we'd go to bed hungry, where we did midnight lifts. So from a Florida standard standpoint, that's one of the things in my mind that people talk about when they talk about bringing back the standard. I'm not trying to sit here and get on a high horse and say that players have it easier nowadays, but you do have 2 coaches in that building who have been in Gainesville and can sit here and say, hey, we won with less. What's stopping you? And I think that's part of why people, especially Florida fans, have clamored for the Gators to add former players to the coaching staff. And it's not just those guys. Obviously, you talked about Mike Peterson, but Brandon Spikes being around as well, with Phil Trautwein having won those championships. That is going to just bring out more, in my opinion, of the players on the roster. So I understand why people were so excited when Phil Trautwein and Bam Hardman were hired, because just what they can bring out of the player mentality standpoint, I think is very invaluable here. One of the last things that we got to talk about, which I also think is invaluable, but also gets a little bit overlooked, is the special teams play. Now, that may sound funny to say it gets overlooked because go back to the last 4 years, it's one of the most constant criticisms that Florida fans have had. And it's not, it's for an interesting reason, because it's not for like inefficient special teams play. Florida's specialists were really, really good. You had Rocco Underwood, who won long snapper of the year. You have Jeremy Crawshaw, who, he didn't win the Ray Guy Award. Yeah, he's a 6th-round pick. And, he's a starting punter in the NFL for one of the NFL's best teams, the Denver Broncos. You've got Trey Smack, who probably hears his name called in April. If not, I think he's going to be around in the NFL for more than a decade. Yeah. You had strong specialist play, but what made the headlines, unfortunately, was all the negative aspects of special teams play. The 10 men on the field or the 12 men on the field. The
13 in some cases.
13 in some cases. And then, you were talking about some of the answers that we would get under the previous regime. You didn't really, you would sometimes have a accountability, but often, or too often, you had times where they said, yeah, we got to figure that out. That field goal block attempt, we wanted to have 10 guys on the field for that. It drew the ire of Florida fans a lot, because this Florida team under Billy Napier did not really have a large margin for error, and substitution infractions and just getting the correct amount of guys out there would make people so livid, justifiably and understandably so, because Florida really couldn't afford it. When you're a well-oiled machine and you make a occasional mistake, but you're beating teams by 20 plus, people aren't going to sit here and say, yeah, we beat Georgia by 15, but we had 10 men on the field. Florida fans knew that they couldn't really afford to make even the simplest of mistakes, or else it could come back to bite Florida, just based on how the offense was and how the coaching was. So sometimes you hire a coach who wants to leave the past in the past, and they don't want to have the previous mistakes attributed to them. But I'll give Jonathan Galante some credit. When he came out and spoke a couple of days ago, he acknowledged that the special teams mistakes were something that they're going to have to clean up, that he's going to have to emphasize it every single day, that John Summerall was going to be involved in the special teams coaching, that they were going to look to obviously be potent in the return game as well, but also look to block kicks and punts. It probably was refreshing for people to see those comments. Again, special teams gets overlooked until it's failing you in a sense, but it had to be refreshing to hear that this coaching staff was aware of what went wrong in Gainesville, and that they, even though they weren't the culprit, was determined to ensure that it would not be something that continues in Gainesville. Did that stand out to you? I know, again, special teams is overlooked, and it's probably the last thing people want to talk about, but that had to be refreshing, right?
It was under the microscope because of the exact reasons you laid out, and Billy Napier got mad about it for all the wrong reasons. I remember, and I don't mean to pat myself on the back too much, but it was during the 23 season, after the Utah game, where they had the multiple special teams infractions, including 2 players wearing the same jersey number going onto the field at the same time. But I think it was after the Charlotte game, or maybe a couple games later, it was another one where 13 players on the field or something like that. And I took it. I said, Billy, how is that a thing? How is that happening? And he got upset. He was like, what specifically are you talking about? I remember it well. It's just like, how is that your approach to such an obvious issue that I think someone who doesn't watch football could probably point out? So yeah, it was refreshing. I mean, what was Galante's quote? He's heard enough about the special teams, Matt, that they finally used. So I've heard from at least one source, and I think multiple, they had a player responsible for counting the number of players on the field with a special teams unit. They had 700 coaches, some up in the box. You could have assigned that to someone, have it communicated. Yeah, we've got our 11, boom, done. And I don't know exactly what it's going to be that Jonathan Galante does to prevent that issue, among other ones that they had. But he mentioned it. He was like, listen, it all starts in the meeting room. They're going to whittle down their special teams depth charts to where they will never have a unit that's supposed to have 2 players with the same number. If they have to, they will make sure they've got a plan in place to make sure that doesn't happen. But in theory, it shouldn't happen in the first place because they're not going to create packages where that could even happen. He took accountability for something he didn't need to take accountability for because, right, he had nothing to do with this. I'm sure he doesn't want to be attached to it, but he's very familiar, whether it's from watching the tape, maybe hearing feedback from players. Shoot, maybe he was paying attention to Twitter when he got hired and people were talking about the whole, pick your special teams gaffe from over the last couple of years. He's heard plenty about it, and it seems that that's one of his primary focuses. In addition to, he had to totally flip the room of specialists. They lost 6 players there. He brought in 6, with the 3 going to the draft and then 3 transfers. So I guess priority number 2 was immediately drilling down, okay, we're going to do things differently here and make sure that we don't run into these mistakes anymore. So another refreshing aspect of this coaching staff is a willingness to address issues honestly and acknowledge things that got to change.
Yeah, it definitely stood out to me. That's why I quickly wrote about it and asked about it. People want to make sure that the mistakes are going to be corrected. So really looking forward to seeing hopefully that come to fruition here in Gainesville. And before we get out of this episode, what does come to fruition this weekend is the start of Florida baseball 2026 season. The Gators take on UAB in a 3-game weekend series to open it. We have an intern over at Swamp247, Hunter DeLauder, who's finishing up his last semester at the University of Florida, and he's going to be helping cover the team for us. He's done some fantastic preseason content. I know our readers over there have been really pleased with the work he's done. He's going to be out at Condon Family Ballpark tonight to watch the Gators open the series against the UAB Blazers. So look for a lot of content from that after the game, before the game, during the game, from that game as well. And then tomorrow I'll be out at the O-Dome to watch Florida basketball take on Kentucky and welcome. We'll see how welcomed he is. Former guard Denzel Aberdeen back to Gainesville here. So it is a busy time in Gainesville. And like we said at the beginning of this episode, spring camp is going to be here before we know it. Only 19 days left until the start of spring camp, less than 3 weeks here in Gainesville. So again, it's going to fly by, and then we'll have a ton of content over at Swamp247. We'll have more podcasts as well. And we're going to continue to interview some assistant coaches. So look for plenty of content over at Swamp247. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Swamp247 podcast. For Zach Goodall, I'm Graham Hall, and we'll see you next time.